Hey everyone, it's Strange Michael. I hope you're doing well today. I'm going to start kicking off the Blair Witch movie reviews. I haven't seen these films in a while. I've never been a big fan of the Blair Witch franchise. Never played the PS4 game that I happened to have bought about 2 years ago for PS4, like I said. And I've never read any of the books and stuff you could get back in the day for middle grade YA audiences and all of that stuff. I've heard they're good, and I've seen some reviews for them on YouTube, but I'm just not going to spend the money to hunt those down. But anyway, as a horror movie review channel and a horror channel in general, I think it's always worthwhile to put your thoughts out there for the big products, the things that people love, people talked about that are iconic or whatever, you know? And in 1999, the original Blair Witch Project that I'm reviewing right now was massively popular. And yes, this is a double feature with Cabin Fever, the film that I love quite a bit more, but that film's goofier and stupider. More stupid. I just ruined my reputation. Blair Witch Project, I've never been a hardcore fan of, and this is probably the fourth time I would say that I've ever seen this movie in my life. The first time being back when I was a teenager and I began to hear about it, and I asked my mom and my grandparents about it when I was still living with all of them back in the day. And they told me the story about how they went to see Blair Witch Project on my grandparents', I believe, anniversary. And they were at the theaters, and they hated it. And they left after the film ended, and they thought it was the worst movie they'd ever seen. And typically with this very controversial, very divisive film, that's usually the general opinion of people saying it's either the worst film they've ever seen or it's the best found footage movie they've ever seen. I can't talk this morning, excuse me. But like I said, it is a found footage film, in case you don't know. It's kind of the movie that popularized that. It's not the first one ever. Everybody wants to argue over this, and whatever the previous film was, everybody tries to say is the OG original found footage film. You didn't really have one popularize it for the public and make it as big of a deal as this film and its marketing. Now, I don't have the sequel film from the next year in 2000, Book of Shadows, but I do have the 2016 Adam Wingard, who I'm a huge fan of, who directed The Guest and You're Next, Godzilla vs. Kong, and Godzilla x Kong New Empire. I love Adam Wingard. I'm a huge fan of the guy for the most part. This is probably his worst movie. I'm not a fan of The Guest, but this is probably his worst film. But I always wanted to see this, and I saw it one time when it came out on DVD, and my thoughts will be given to you whenever I get around to reviewing that. So Blair Witch Project, like I said, found footage film. If you haven't seen it before, it is quite an experience. And when I say that, I mean it's mostly people wandering around in the woods in a very small aspect ratio, because they're shooting on actual kind of camcorders you could own at that time in the 90s. I've had one of these. I think a lot of people my age have had one of these that their family have had, like their grandparents, or mainly dudes in your family, like your dad, your grandpa, your uncle. Somebody will have this kind of camera that this was shot with. This is a low-budget film, like I said. I think it was made for like a handful of thousands of bucks. We're not talking hundreds of thousands. We're talking like 6,000, 10,000, something like that. A lot of the suspense in this film is relied on the dark of the woods. And in case you've never been in the woods at nighttime, in IRL, it is horrifically scary. It doesn't matter if you have a flashlight or anything. You will not be able to see like you can in Hollywood films. Think of like the dark time, nighttime scenes on like Lord of the Rings or Underworld or something. It doesn't look like that. If you're out in the woods, it does not look like that. It's not just blue. It's not lit up very well because of the fucking moon. It's not like that. And that's what this film relies on, is that and some of the sound effects that happen at nighttime. But basically, this is about 3 film students, kind of the ringleader of them being a girl named Heather, and the other 2 are named Josh and Mike. And they go out into this area that used to be called Blair, and now it's been renamed because, for whatever reason, apparently there were some murders and stuff out at this place. And in Blair, which is now renamed to whatever, Barkersville or something, while they're out there, they are investigating a witch that supposedly existed out in the woods. And a lot of the locals still to this day, even though they haven't had an encounter or recent murders in recent years, people still seem to be terrified of this almost urban legend that's not really an urban legend. It's just been around for so long as some kind of myth that people are still kind of creeped out about going out in the woods. They do some small interviews with some locals just to kind of see what their general thoughts are on the Blair Witch idea. The Blair Witch Project is basically these three filmmakers going out in the woods, getting lost, and screaming. Screaming and fighting and bickering because of the tension rising about being lost. If you've ever been driving on a vacation and let's say your TomTom GPS died, you didn't have a map, you guys kind of panic a little bit. Not so much nowadays, people have cell phones and stuff they can track GPS on, and that's helpful, but that small amount of time between your GPS dying on the car and then the GPS on your phone being updated or whatever from Google Maps, everybody is going to be arguing in the car about what the next turn could be, what they remember the next turn being, especially if it's a return trip instead of a go-to trip. And it's very interesting how being lost can raise tension, even in a place that's not abandoned like a freeway, amongst people, amongst friends for that matter. And these three here, being out in the woods in 1999, they are bickering and fighting mainly because of the fear of being lost out in the woods. They could starve to death, they're not seeing other people anywhere, and the tensions begin to rise because some of them begin to seem like they're starting to lose their mind, just a tad bit. But for me, these three are not the best actors. They give a decent performance, mainly because it's a low-budget film. It was supposed to feel realistic, you know, and I don't know if these three ever went on to do anything else, the three main actors. But the movie itself, I think that they're fine for the realistic performance they have to give. The problem that I have is that I'm always into the Blair Witch Project for like the first half of the movie, maybe even especially the first third of the film. When you get to the midway point, things begin to kind of slow down, it kind of begins to drag its feet. The movie's only an hour and 20 minutes long, so it kind of zooms by, to be honest with you, compared to even the most boring of Friday the 13th films. You know, it has a good tendency to take its time when it runs out of story, about halfway through, when things begin to happen to our main characters who are getting lost, who are losing their map, and so on and so on. And by the end of it, it's so, I wouldn't even say random. It kind of is, but it's kind of not. It's the setup for every PS1-styled modern-day video game you see on, like, different YouTube channels nowadays that people are playing that are made by, you know, people trying to make their own video games and stuff. Blair Witch Project, I've never thought it was scary, to be honest with you. My wife was upstairs yesterday after she had worked outside and stuff, and she was doing something, and I decided, okay, I'll be down here, I'll turn off all the lights. It was pretty late enough where it was dark down here pretty well, and I watched Blair Witch Project by myself. And it bored me to tears. It just bored me to tears, man. I'm always bored by this movie by the end of it. I just don't think it's that good. And every time I try to watch it, of course, back in the day when it released, people thought it was real. Quite a few people thought it was real. The marketing made it seem like that without saying it, and they had websites dedicated to it. Apparently Blair Witch Project 2, Book of Shadows, plays up on that a little bit. I haven't seen that movie except for maybe once when I was very young on TV. And I may have even seen that before I saw this movie, matter of fact. To be honest with you, now that I think about it in hindsight. But that film kind of plays up on that idea a little bit too, from what I understand. Blair Witch Project, though, it relies on soundscape. It relies on people, if you don't know, with a boombox out in the woods playing noises to scare us, the audience, who are hearing like children laughing and stuff outside of the main character's tent at nighttime. If that stuff doesn't get to you, I don't think anything will in this movie. I just don't. I don't think it's that scary. When I watched it in the dark yesterday, again, and I've done this numerous times with Blair Witch Project, I just don't think it's that effective. I never have, I never will, probably. I always try to put myself in the shoes of the people back in the 90s who were seeing this for the first time, and I constantly think about how even back then, I would have been more like my grandparents, and my mom, who saw it after my grandparents, and thinking that I just don't like this movie. I don't like anything it really has going for it. It's boring. I just don't think it's that good of a movie. This is not coming from some teenager. This is coming from an almost 30-year-old who loved horror his entire life. And on top of that, I'm a die-hard found footage fan. I watch everything I can from the found footage subgenre of horror. I love it. I made a video recently in response to my boy BD Horror, or the Horror Tavern. If you haven't seen his videos, go check him out, a good friend of mine. he asked me and a lot of my friends in the community from Goosebumps and horror to make a video about our top 5 subgenres of horror. Found footage was like number 2 for me, because I love it. I can just watch it all day long. There's something about it that's super effective, even if it's a jump scare film, or if it's like kind of an action film like The Monster Project. I love it. There's so much that this subgenre can offer, and personally it scares me a lot more than most subgenres out there. I don't really get scared very often, but when I do, it's because of the found footage subgenre of horror. And I get annoyed when I see people lump in what it does nowadays, and even the good budgets people can make nowadays with it, with their iPhones and whatever, compared to what you had with Blair Witch Project, which in my opinion is shot out of focus too often. It's made by wannabe filmmaker students. A lot of it's in black and white with that pretentious character development of Heather, for example. And I don't really like that because of how out of focus it is. It gets a little, with a lot of the shaky cam, with the camera moving too much, kind of makes me sick, to be honest with you. And a lot of found footage can have that, nowadays or back then. I just think it's not effective the way a lot of stuff is that I enjoy, especially recent films like the fear footage movies. If you haven't seen those, go check those out. I don't know. Blair Witch Project, I respect it because of how iconic it is to film buffs and to, I guess, horror fans if you want to go there. But I do think that I cannot sit here and tell you that I don't think there's some nature of weird pretentiousness or weird at that time presentism that you had to be there to experience the hype, the fear of this possibly being real, to really enjoy it. Now, I was around, I just hadn't seen it yet. And I just think it's so funny when I think about my grandparents every time I watch this movie and how much they hated this. They ranted about this movie forever when I started bringing it up when I saw it for the first time around my teenage years. They would rave about how much they hated it. It was so fun to think about those days. So you still see people say that to this day. I'm not really a hater on this film because, like I said, I like the first half of it. I think it's pretty solid for the most part, despite my not real love for these main characters. Again, it's not the actor's fault. It's more of the writing that they didn't get, you know? There's some cool behind-the-scenes stories about this movie, and I like that about Blair Witch Project. I feel like it can make the experience a little bit better, but the film itself and the success of somebody like Eduardo Sanchez, who is one of the co-directors and co-writers of the film, if you can call it a co-writer, I feel like he's extremely overloved, to be honest. And it's not a diss on Eduardo Sanchez. It's just kind of the reason I don't think he made as much in his film career is because I think Hollywood could recognize this guy's kind of a hack, just a little bit. Maybe there was some nice creativity that he and his co-director, co-writer did with this film, but I've never been a Sanchez fan that much. I understand the name is out there, people know the name, but I just don't think Blair Witch Project deserves the love that it got, aside from people thinking it was real back in the day. And when people talk about that and they say people thought it was real, let's be honest, I would be willing to bet that it's the Paranormal Activity syndrome, that I bet you teenagers are the ones who mainly thought that this was real. And that's probably why it succeeded so well. Teens had not seen anything like it before. And usually, in my opinion, teenagers are what make horror continue onward. Whether it be the Friday films, the slasher subgenre back in the day, the Conjuring films now, or the Paranormal Activity films 15 years ago, you know? Blair Witch Project, for me, is a bit of a mess. I'm not a fan, like I said. I want to love this movie. I really do. And I like I said, about a good half of it. But I will tell you, like I said in my video the other day, I think there's a good chunk of this movie, the 2016 sequel, that I think is a lot better. I think some of this film I like more, specifically in the ending I think I like a lot more than this OG film. But with the budget they had of this OG movie, you have to respect that. You don't have drones and shit like the 2016 film. You don't have dumb logic and dumb characters like the previous 2016 film I just showed you. You have characters who are just new to this whole experience. I love found footage films because they typically can encapsulate what urban legends coming to life can be like. And this movie, I think, does that very, very, very well. If you've never seen Blair Witch Project, I would recommend it to you to see at least once in your life. It's one of those horror films that whether I love it, whether I hate it, you can't help but respect it, like I said a moment ago. and what it did at the time it came out to audiences, whether we're talking about older audiences, horror audiences, teenager audiences, it doesn't matter. The fact that it made the impact and the milestone that it made all those years ago, at this point, what, that's 25 years ago? That's crazy. But the fact that it made the impact that it had at the time, and people still remember it when you bring up the title, they've at least probably heard of it if they love horror films. Horror films to this day, found footage or otherwise, still make reference to this movie, and there's even parody films of it that involve scenes like the nasty ass snot scene in this movie. If you haven't seen it, but you have seen it, the snot scene is disgusting. I gag every time I watch this movie, including yesterday, by the way. So Blair Witch Project, there's really not much more to say about it. I like half of the film, and that's it. It loses me, it's not scary, it's not creepy, there's no real atmosphere to it, in my personal opinion. The bickering, bantering stuff really starts to lose steam halfway through for me, and then it begins to collapse in on itself. But like I said, at least it's an hour and 20 minutes, and that's it. It really manages to have a good pace, despite being kind of boring, you know? A lot of found footage films have this solution to the problem there, I would say. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. A lot of the time that just means they ran out of steam, but, you know, it is what it is. So, my thoughts on the Blair Witch Project are that it's very, very fine. If you haven't seen it before, I'd recommend it to you to see at least once in your life. It's one of those films like Friday the 13th's OG film. Even if you're not a fan of that original film, it's worth seeing at least once in your life, you know? A lot of films out there. The Exorcist. I'm not even a big fan of The Exorcist. I like it more than this, obviously, but that's a film that even though I'm not a hardcore fan of, I'd recommend to somebody to see at least once in their life. Cabin Fever, another one, that it was a huge deal when it came out. People forget how big of a deal Cabin Fever was, and it only came out like less than 5 years after Blair Witch Project. So anyway, that is the review, and if I had to rate Blair Witch Project on a 5-star basis, I'd probably give it like a... I like half of it, so I give it like a kind of high 2 out of 5 stars. I would almost go with 3, you know? I don't really give in-between reviews when it comes to ratings, but I would do somewhere in that ballpark. Leaning more towards a 2 because I always feel like I waste my time when I finish this film. But it couldn't be worse than what I've heard and what I remember of Book of Shadows, the next film. So next week, when I get around to reviewing that, I will talk about it, and we'll see what you think about it too, down in the comments. So anyway, Blair Witch Project, guys, I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, what you thought about it if you saw it back in the day or whenever you saw it for the first time, whether it be recent years or back then when it released. I'd love to hear everything you have to say about it. Thank you all for watching, guys. God bless you all. Catch you later, and goodbye.